Many people were dissuaded from joining the army, either because they saw it as too strict or too dangerous. They would rather live in squalor and uncertainty than be obliged to follow its various rules and regulations, or face danger in battle. It didn't matter that the death rate of soldiers was lower than that of ordinary civilians. Even the survivors who had heard that this was the case didn't fully believe it. They were much more inclined to follow the general consensus than to try to absorb the actual data. Joining the logistics division, however, was a different matter. This position boasted the same security as all military positions, while not requiring any actual fighting. The level of protection provided meant that its members didn't have to worry about anyone stealing their food or other hard-won resources. Naturally then, Alice's parents jumped at the chance to join. But Charles could sense that Alice had some misgivings. "Sean's coming with us," he told her. "Surely you don't want him to hear that his parents were killed just after he left them. It makes much more sense to send them into logistics, where you won't have to see them, but you'll know that they're safe." She didn't say anything. She knew that even with the crystal cores they had given her parents, they would still struggle to survive if they were left to fend for themselves. However, it was difficult for her to conjure much sympathy for the two miserable, petty people. Complicating matters, though, were her memories from her childhood, when her mom had done her best to care for her. No matter the decisions that Penny had made since then, Alice's fond memories kept her from seriously entertaining the notion of abandoning her mom. She could also see how much they would benefit from joining the logistics division. Sending them there would mean she could carry on with her own mission without being held back by guilt. After Penny and Francis left for the logistics division, Charles took Lenny to look for Aunt Sue. On the way, Lenny asked to see the document Charles had used to intimidate Phil, and Charles handed it over. "First Division Commander of the Montreal Military," Lenny read out loud. "Captain of Montreal's Special Combat Squad. Wow! You really have so many titles?" He couldn't believe Charles had accomplished so much in the past 2 months. "Of course not," said Charles. "It's fake." "Fake?" Lenny asked, distraught. It felt like he would never get completely accustomed to the deception and corruption in the new world, and Charles's ruthlessness seemed to know no limits. "But if the army finds out, they'll execute you," Lenny cried. Charles shook his head. "Don't worry about that. I got the document from one of my army contacts. In fact, they have more reason to consider this document as genuine than I do." He knew that as he and the military were fighting for the same cause, even if an officer did find that he was carrying falsified documents, they would certainly turn a blind eye. Lenny didn't know what to think about all of this. All he knew was that he didn't want to hold on to the document a moment longer. He passed it back to Charles as though he was worried about catching something from it through prolonged contact. He could see that Charles knew what he was doing, and had to accept that whatever the consequences of his fake certificate, Charles knew how to settle his own affairs. Lenny thought with some dismay that if he was the one who got caught with such a document instead of Charles, he would be executed in an instant. They soon arrived at the address for Aunt Sue that Charles had found in the military's register. When they knocked on the door, though, there was no answer. Some people were hanging around on the street, and Charles turned on them. Without even attempting to act courteous, he threw one man against the wall and demanded to be told where Aunt Sue could be found. The man stuttered and stammered, but insisted he didn't know. Still, Charles could sense that he knew more than he was letting on, and raised a fist in the air to jog the man's memory. Okay, the man said. "I'll tell you everything." Aunt Sue was Charles's mother's younger sister. After his parents had sought refuge, they had lost touch with Sue. Even so, on the few occasions that he and his parents had gone to Washington in his previous life, she had treated them warmly. Later on in that life, she had sacrificed herself in order to protect Charles. And so in his new life, Charles knew he had to repay the favor somehow. The man told Charles that Aunt Sue's husband had died soon after the zombies had first descended on Washington. Shortly afterward, her daughter had awakened her superpowers, and just 5 days prior, the two of them had left the area. Apparently, Charles's cousin's powers were great, and as she was known to have a strong temper, nobody had dared to ask where they had gone. Charles was a little concerned by the news. He pushed the man to one side before turning on a few of the onlookers, who all confirmed the story. He sighed. "Sounds like they really don't know where they've gone," he said. Lenny looked glumly at the people Charles had drawn the information from. His show of force had been nothing compared to what Lenny had already seen him do, but it still left Lenny with an ugly feeling. "The Army's information was correct, if a little out of date," Charles said. Of course, they don't have the resources to track everyone's movements. My family was here, but they've moved on. In my previous life, Aunt Sue's family had all died, but I don't know exactly how. Could this all have something to do with my cousin? He didn't know much about his cousin. After all, his parents had rarely interacted with her side of the family for fear that they might implicate them in their own activities. He frowned, trying to work out his next steps. "We found out all we can here," he said at last. "I guess there's a chance that I'm so well known by now that my cousin might end up tracking me down herself." Almost as an afterthought, he dropped some food, water, and crystal cores on the ground before leaving to thank the people for their information. When they saw the fresh bread and mineral water, the people immediately forgot their injuries in fright and scrabbled to pick up the supplies. Charles had left enough food for everyone, though, so they didn't need to fight each other over it. They returned to their homes laden with more food than they had had in a long time, thinking that they would be happy to undergo more interrogations in the future if they were compensated so nicely in return. Lenny watched them, completely dumbstruck, sensing that he had only scratched the surface of the desperate nature of this miserable new world. 3 days later, the Dawnians regrouped at the meeting spot outside of Washington. By that point, Charles had sent Lenny to the logistics division to help everyone cook, put up tents, and take inventory of their supplies. He didn't give him any preferential treatment with regards to the tasks, but Lenny was grateful nonetheless. He had almost gone crazy during his 2 months of isolation, and was glad to be finally doing anything useful. Harper came to find Charles at the end of the 3 days to tell him that 4 of their paranormals had gone missing. "According to our investigation, they've joined a small group somewhere in the city to bully protection money from the locals," she said. "They've already found a family that they're preying on. I'm afraid that they're lost to us. Should we go and teach them a lesson?" Although Dawn City's defectors usually discarded their communication devices, she was confident she would still be able to track them down if need be. Charles shook his head. "They have the right to their own decisions," he said. "Everything they gained as members of Dawn City was achieved through hard work. They don't owe us anything now, nor we them. If they want to leave, let them." Dawn City had been founded on the principle of equal exchange, where its members got out whatever they put in. This had been very attractive at the outset, because it meant that their hard work would be instantly rewarded by the group's protection. As time went on, though, some decided they were unwilling to put in the work. Rather than punish them, Charles's credo was simply to push them out and let them find their own way. But he would look at them a lot less kindly if they ended up selling information about Dawn City to outsiders. After hearing Charles's judgment on the deserters, the others in his group were less interested in pursuing the matter. When the team had set off for Washington, it had been around 300 strong. On the way, they had lost some of their original number, but had also picked up more than 200 survivors. Some of the members had also been joined by their families living in the city, meaning that they stood at close to 600 members. Charles was a little concerned that their logistics division had grown too large for the overall size of the group, and was eager to give his followers some more first-hand experience of conflict. "We'll soon be going to the front line," he announced from a vantage point atop one of the ruined walls. "You can choose to stay here, but you'll have to fend for yourselves while the rest of us are gone. Otherwise, you can follow us and fight. If you come along, you won't all be forced to face the enemy directly, but it'll still be dangerous." Some of his followers shouted out their support. "We'll follow you, sir. As long as you keep us fed, we'll do whatever you ask. It feels like nowhere's safe in this world, so we might as well follow you into battle. Better to follow our leader than stay behind unprotected." Charles wasn't at all surprised by their loyalty. They all had at least some experience of fighting zombies, especially the new people who had been rescued along the way, who had spent much of the past 2 months fighting for their lives every day in the wilderness. Even the dozen or so paranormals among them realized that their powers were no guarantee that they would endure. On the other hand, it seemed obvious that staying close to Charles significantly improved their chances of survival. Besides, anyone who might have chosen not to follow him had left the group a long time ago. Accompanied by the reinforcements from Montreal, Charles led his followers in the direction of the battlefield. They were ultimately bound for Baltimore, but would likely have to face other battles along the way. Baltimore had fallen to the zombies soon after the beginning of the apocalypse. Only around 30% of the original population had survived. Naturally, they had turned to Washington for help, although what they had asked for hadn't been reinforcements, but nuclear weapons. The bombs had ravaged the area, wiping out a large number of the already dwindling population. Those who had made it through to the other side had developed a great pride in their ability to endure so much devastation. Although the military hadn't properly explained why they had asked for nuclear weapons, their actions had still received the support of many people. At the time, Leonard, one of the highest-ranking generals, had made a declaration to the people. "If we don't do this, the zombies will kill us all. We need to secure the safety of our own people before we think about helping the outside world." Although it had been a very cold-blooded outlook, he had quickly gained the support of many people. They had been further convinced when they had considered that, by comparison, the population of Washington had survived the early days of the apocalypse relatively unscathed. The people in Baltimore had harbored some doubts and had questioned whether it really was worth killing so many of their own people in order to obliterate the zombies. But it had been clear that the alternative had been that the zombies would kill them all. After hearing of Leonard's actions, Anthony and the others finally understood why Charles had scolded them so severely when they had so rashly volunteered themselves in Montreal. "Why didn't anyone punish Leonard?" asked Alice, seething. "His reputation is too high," said Greg. "He's also very strong. He's done a lot to protect the area. Many people here will never forget that, and more often than not will give him the benefit of the doubt, even if his methods are extreme." Alice was speechless. From her outsider's perspective, sacrificing so many people at once was hard to accept. But it was clear that the people from Washington were grateful for Leonard's actions. After all, there was only so much protection the military could give, so it made a sort of sense that they had resorted to nuclear weapons. In doing so, though, Leonard had greatly angered the soldiers, who no longer felt as valued and had even begun to fight among themselves. Many of them had declared that they refused to take orders from a general of another area, and their insubordination had spread so far that before long, some had refused to take orders from their own superiors. One was Arthur O'Connor, a well-known soldier who had declared, "I'm not afraid to sacrifice myself to protect the people of Baltimore, but I'm not willing to do it. They didn't even give us a chance to help them." Many of his comrades agreed with him. They were great in number, well-trained, and equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, and yet their superiors hadn't even given them a chance to help the situation. Instead, they had turned immediately to the nuclear option, not only killing thousands of innocents, but suggesting that the soldiers were completely surplus to requirements. Charles knew the real reason that the generals had been so quick to choose the nuclear option. It was simply that crystal cores couldn't be destroyed by nuclear weapons. Leonard's strategy had allowed him to clear the area of enemies, and then he had been able to sweep in and take all the resources. Leonard was one of the Tungsten League and was widely considered the most powerful man in America. In Charles's mind, he was responsible for some of the greatest disasters to befall the country. Charles had spent some time reevaluating Leonard in his new life, and I realized that Leonard likely knew something that everyone else didn't. Although he couldn't possibly be privy to as many secrets as Charles had learned since his rebirth, he clearly knew something about the zombies and their crystal cores. Charles knew that in years to come, Leonard would lead a coup in the army. His revolution would draw many strong people to his side, and many of those who resisted would be swiftly defeated by him. Although he was based in Baltimore, many troops directly under his command also had control in Washington. In fact, if not for Richard's strong hold over Montreal, a result of his powerful combat strength and great military leadership, Leonard would have extended his power even further, taking control of many other areas. What astounded Charles was the knowledge that even if Leonard were to dominate the entire country, most people would simply accept his authority, respecting his formidable strength and ignoring the innocent people he had killed to get to that position. To many people, Leonard was America's guardian. To Charles, he was America's destruction. Leonard had used all sorts of devious tactics to grow his power. He nurtured the zombie population to ensure a steady supply of crystal cores. He was even known to turn his own followers into zombies and absorb their energy. He would purposefully kill the stronger zombies so that the weaker ones would have the opportunity to grow. He even helped those weak zombies kill humans to encourage their evolution. Under his influence, Maryland as a whole had become a paradise for zombies. Elsewhere, he had allowed packs of zombies to breach survival bases just so that he could turn up, kill the zombies as though he were the savior of the people, and collect their crystal cores. Early on, when people had caught wind of his dirty tactics, they hadn't dared to expose him. Before long, though, he didn't even need to worry about being exposed. He felt sure that nobody could stop him even if they had tried. Charles could never let such a monster get away with his terrible behavior. Even if it weren't for his intense hatred of the man, he would be doing his family and friends a disservice not to go after Leonard. Left unchecked, he could easily turn the entire Earth into a paradise for zombies, over which he would have total control. To him, complete and utter control was the only thing that mattered, even if the rest of humanity perished in his search for it. The reason nobody tried to stop Leonard in the early stages is that they relied on his strength, Charles said to the group. Back then, he was callous but not completely evil. If we let him carry on, though, nobody will be able to stop him. He'll end up killing everyone who refuses to obey him and replace them with his own people. 300,000 soldiers will die, not on the battlefield, but by his command. His eyes flashed with pain and anger. It's true what they say, he said. The winner takes all. Leonard is counting on the truth of that old saying. He reflected that the strength of their morals and the greatness of their contributions to the country would be for nothing if someone like Leonard simply swooped in and took all the rewards for himself. If he won, the population would follow him almost unthinkingly, without reflecting that he had wreaked such havoc in their homeland. No matter how egregious his crimes, the survivors of Washington would obey him mindlessly. Even those who did reflect on the situation would recognize that they had the option either to destroy him or obey him. Although as they had no realistic chance of destroying him, it wasn't really an option. From then on, his growth would be unstoppable. Fortunately, there were a few people in the country capable of halting him in his tracks if they banded together. One was Richard, commander of the Montreal Army, while other strong leaders were making themselves known elsewhere, showing their value by giving their lives to stop Leonard in any way they could. Still, because only Charles knew what Leonard was to become, he couldn't yet act against him, or else the military would think him crazy. His only option was to strike Leonard after the current chaos had subsided, when Leonard would turn against the army. If Leonard won, Washington would fall. If Charles won, Leonard would be defeated once and for all, with each of his crimes punished one by one. At that point, Charles would become the hero of the country, but he didn't care about that. He wanted only an opportunity to kill Leonard. He needed to recognize the opportunity when it arose and act on it decisively. If he missed it, there was no guarantee that another would present itself. Under the guidance of the military, Charles's team soon reached one of the front lines of battle. They hadn't yet left Washington. When they arrived, Charles was annoyed to find members of a super squad. There's 24 areas in Washington under attack by mutated zombies, said the officer in charge of receiving and managing the reinforcements. This is the 23rd, and things are particularly difficult there. In fact, this is the reason we called for reinforcements in the first place. In order to give us the best shot, we recruited some super squads to assist you in your defense. I wish you all the best of luck. What did you say? Asked a Montreal soldier. We're happy to fight no matter the danger, but you really expect us to cooperate with a super squad? Are you kidding me? Don't you know how disobedient they can be? What'll happen when they break ranks or turn on us? These are General Leonard's orders, said the officer politely. If you can show your worth here, you'll be assigned more defense work elsewhere. The Montreal soldiers were furious at the new arrangements. They felt completely disrespected, outraged that they had traveled so far, only to be told they had to fight alongside such badly organized and untrustworthy wasters as made up the super squads. Lewis was the strongest Montreal soldier, but his troop was full of other level 5 experts. Some might have considered it unusual for such powerful soldiers to be among the frontline soldiers. However, in many cases, it was the heat of the front line that had led to those soldiers developing their powers and surpassing those more senior in rank. Although the people in Charles's circle had developed their abilities largely thanks to their use of crystal cores, the soldiers on the front lines, many of whom had killed thousands of zombies during the attack on Butte, had grown in strength through experience alone. The strength of frontline soldiers couldn't be underestimated. After Archer had provoked the army by gaining access to the water mansion in Charles's previous life, he had been killed on the spot by a mere rank-and-file soldier. Archer had, of course, learned many powerful techniques in the process of accessing the mansion, and even had a divine seed in his body. But he had been killed before he had a chance to use it. It was clear then that so-called regular soldiers weren't to be trifled with. Charles could sense Lewis's barely contained rage on hearing about the new arrangement. Don't do anything you'll regret, he said quietly, placing a hand on Lewis's shoulder. Remember, we're in Washington and have to follow Washington's orders for now. Then he faced the officer who had delivered the news. Make sure you deliver our supplies on time, he said. I don't think you want anyone on the wrong side of Washington's super squad if they find out General Leonard is withholding rations." "Of course," said the officer, maintaining his polite expression. "In fact, our first batch of supplies has already been delivered. We'll send a new load every 3 days. The greater your success on the battlefield, of course, the higher the quality of supplies." He briefly fixed Charles with a look of disdain before leaving with his men. Charles was mortified, as though the man had just suggested he was a coward, unwilling to fight unless he got his precious supplies. After they had left, Lewis turned to Charles. "Since when did you learn to control your temper?" he asked. The Charles he thought he knew would never have taken such disrespect on the chin. He had seen Charles's ruthlessness on the battlefield, and had even known him to kill his own people if the mood took him. "It doesn't matter what these people tell us," said Charles. "This is Washington, and we need to toe the line for the time being." Regardless of his measured words, there was an icy tone to his voice. But he had waited the last 2 months for an opportunity to face Leonard, and he knew that a little longer wouldn't hurt if it led to the perfect chance to kill his enemy. If he missed his shot by acting too impulsively, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "Okay," said Lewis, nodding to the super squad as inconspicuously as possible. "I'm just concerned about working with this lot. They aren't easy to deal with. If they act out of line, things could turn south fast." "There aren't too many of them," said Charles. "Leave them to me." "Don't kill them all," said Lewis in a panic. "No matter what, they're here to help us. If we kill them all now, we'll be at even more of a disadvantage in the battle." Charles was silent for 2 seconds. Then he said coldly, "I hear you. I'll leave some of them alive." Lewis hadn't told him not to kill any of them after all. He'd only told him not to kill all of them. "That's not what Lewis said before trailing off. "I know I can't kill all of them," said Charles. "Otherwise we won't have an army at all." Besides, he knew that if he killed the entire super squad, Washington would never forgive them or help them in the future. Charles handed Lewis a communication token. "Use this to stay in touch," he said. "It only transmits sound, so it isn't as useful as a communication device. But we're about to enter the radiation zone, where electrical devices wouldn't work." Lewis took the token. "How dangerous do you think it'll be in there?" he asked. Charles shrugged. "The entire world is dangerous," he said. "There's no guarantee any of us will get through the day. Just be glad we have each other to help out." "I understand," said Lewis, and he left to prepare his troops for battle. Before they arrived at the camp, Charles sent Dale ahead to set up a stone platform almost 50 feet high. Then Charles climbed to the top of it to address all those present. "Listen to me," he said. "From now on, your duty is to protect this country. The only way we'll manage that is if you obey me absolutely." The super squad were furious. "Who the hell are you?" one of them cried out. "Why should we listen to your orders?" "We came here to fight monsters, not to listen to you babble on," shouted another. "Did you just build that platform to make yourself look impressive?" asked a third. "Someone teach this guy a lesson," shouted the first. Emboldened by their numbers, the members of the super squad started cracking their knuckles and rubbing their fists, ready to take Charles on as soon as he came down from the platform. None of them wanted to be the first to try to climb it, though. Charles looked down on them all, smiling as he saw that a fight was brewing. The members of the super squad started shoving one another, hoping to force one of their number to be the first to stand up against Charles. "I can see you're all very weak," he called down from the platform. "But if you band together, you should be okay in the battle." His arrogance riled the squad still further. "Did he just call us weak?" one asked. "And what does he mean we'll be okay?" asked another. "What nerve!" "Get on down here," one of them cried out. "Face us on the ground if you have the guts." "Whoever built that platform, build me another," shouted the first. "Let me get up there and show him what's what." Enraged by his patronizing attitude, some of them readied themselves to join him on the platform. "If you really mean it," said Charles, "let's have a challenge. Anyone who defeats me will take my role as military commander. We're living in an era where only the strong are respected, so let's find out who really is the strongest." The crowd quieted a bit, excited by the promise of a test of strength. Charles took out a black spear. "If any of you dare to come up and face me," he said, "be my guest. Defeat me and command of the army is yours. Any equipment and supplies sent by the higher-ups, you'll get every bit of it." This excited the crowd even more. They knew there had to be plenty of equipment on its way, and it thrilled them to think they might get full ownership of it. Some Earth-type and Water-type paranormals in the squad started to erect stone or ice platforms as tall as Charles's, with steps around the central column so that they could all ascend. Falling from such a height wouldn't be fatal to all of them, so they were all inspired to give it their best shot. "I'll challenge you," shouted a sword-type paranormal, who turned his arms into long swords and started up the steps of one of the columns. Charles sneered when the newcomer arrived on the platform. Then he snapped the point from the top of his spear and dropped it onto the floor of the platform. "Huh?" said the paranormal. "What are you doing?" "If I fought you with a spear, I'd run you through in a moment," said Charles. "But with this black staff, we'll have a fairer fight." The swordsman lunged at Charles, slashing at him with extreme speed. But as soon as he got within Charles's reach, a powerful force swept him off his feet and flung him from the platform. He hurtled off the edge before landing on the ground with a crunch, where he lay groaning in the dirt and coughing up blood, his body shattered. Calvin approached and cast a healing spell on him. "You're only a level 4 paranormal," he said while healing the man. "If he hadn't held back, you'd be dead by now." The crowd wondered how badly their teammate would have fared if Charles hadn't downgraded his spear, and they were amazed by Calvin's healing technique. One of them said, "You're a level 5 light element paranormal?" At that moment, they realized where their teammate had gone wrong, and that it had been foolish to try to fight Charles one-on-one. As though reading their minds, Charles said, "You're much too weak to take me on one at a time. Better all come up together. If I kill you, though, you'll only have yourselves to blame." He leaned casually on his staff and looked at the squad with amusement. "Go!" shouted one of them. "We need to put this brat in his place." Although they had just seen Charles's great strength, they were still overcome by anger at his attitude. Led by their anger, they rushed up to the top of the platform to take him on. The air filled with screams as Charles dispatched his enemies. Within minutes, they all lay moaning and injured on the ground. Calvin went from one to the next, healing them and pulling them back from the brink of death. The squad couldn't believe how strong Charles was. He had defeated them all with nothing but an old stick. They didn't dare think what might have happened if he hadn't removed the spearhead. After more than 30 of their number lay injured on the ground, there were few left who were brave enough to face him. A spear-type level 5 paranormal picked up one of his comrade's short swords that lay in the dirt. "Look at this broken sword," he said. "Made from the spine of a level 5 lynx. And yet this guy broke it just like a stick. We're no match for him." The others nodded. "How did he cause so much damage with a stick?" one asked. "If I knew how to wield a stick that way, I'd be able to take on the whole zombie horde myself," said another. "Forget it," said one of his teammates. "You're just a level 4. It isn't only his weapon that makes him so powerful. He's also at level 5. We could never be a match for him, no matter the power of our equipment." "Weapons are part of a person's strength, though," said the other. Whatever made up a person's power, it was clear that Charles's ability was almost impossible to believe. At the top of the platform, he aimed his staff like a javelin and flung it down to the ground. It pierced through one of the super squad members, killing him instantly. "If you think my strength just comes from my weapon," Charles shouted, "then you're welcome to it. If anyone thinks they can beat me with that divine weapon, come up and prove it." Everyone watched as a level 5 paranormal approached the corpse of the man that Charles had skewered with his iron staff. The paranormal was a spear type, and his face alternated between being green and white as he looked at his dead squadmate and the weapon lodged in his chest. He had the ability to judge Charles's strength just by looking at him, and he knew that the weapon Charles had used wasn't particularly strong or sharp, which meant that Charles was a menacingly powerful foe, even unarmed. But with everyone looking at the spear-type paranormal, he felt he couldn't retreat. So he pulled the iron staff out of the corpse's chest, climbed onto the high platform, and said to Charles, "All right then, grab another weapon. I want to see if you're still as awe-inspiring as before." The spear-type paranormal didn't feel very confident, and he could see the looks of disdain on the crowd's faces. Many people in the crowd thought that Charles relied very heavily on his weaponry to win, and they knew that no one who needed weapons to win could compare to someone who only relied on their unarmed combat skills. Charles replied with a sneer, "Against you, I don't need any weapons at all." The spear-type paranormal looked very embarrassed and humiliated by Charles's disparaging comment. "Right then, take what's coming to you," shouted the paranormal. Turning the iron staff in his hand into a long spear, he tried to get the jump on Charles and sweep him off the high platform. He already knew that Charles could attack swiftly, and that he could strike down a dozen people in just a few seconds. His combination of strength and speed was terrifying and deadly. He wanted Charles to fall off the platform and be as humiliated in front of the crowd as he had been by Charles's sneering words. Even if he wasn't strong enough to push him off the platform, the paranormal thought he could make Charles lose his footing by having to dodge his blows. Either way, he hoped Charles would end up 15 feet below on the ground looking like an idiot. If the paranormal could make Charles look stupid and prevent him from successfully controlling the entire super squad, then his task from the higher-ups would be complete. The people below the platform looked up to watch the fight. Even though the platform was tall, it wasn't very wide, so they had a good view of what was happening on top of it. Facing the paranormal's sweeping iron spear, Charles chopped at it with the side of his hand, his fingers held firmly together, and half of the paranormal's weapon went flying towards him and hit him hard, injuring his chest. The broken iron spear then flew through the air and landed on the ground near a group of onlookers. "Did he really use only his hand to break that spear?" asked one. "Well, it must be made of weak metal," said another. "No," replied the first. "It's made from dark iron. It could withstand the attack of a level 5 paranormal, and he did break it with just his bare hand." The people realized that Charles clearly didn't need to rely on weapons to win a fight. He had destroyed the spear in the blink of an eye. The spear-type paranormal had misled them, and they were terrified. If he could dispose of a dark iron spear so easily, how would they fare if he struck them? Up on the platform, the spear-type paranormal broke out in a cold sweat. He could feel the sweat running down his back and trickling over his forehead, but he was fixed to the spot with fear. He felt like a criminal on death row waiting for the final verdict as he faced Charles. Charles raised his hand and prepared to attack. The paranormal could see him staring at his neck with murderous intent. "You have one chance to save your miserable skin," said Charles. "Jump down to the ground and admit defeat. Otherwise, my next blow will land on your neck, and you know what that'll do to you." The spear-type paranormal immediately leaped off the platform to the boos and jeers of the crowd. Just a few moments earlier, the paranormal had doubted Charles's ability in unarmed combat. But after he had seen for himself just how skillful Charles was, and that he could easily win a fight without relying on weapons, the paranormal was convinced he didn't stand a chance. All he had to do was raise his hand, and I was just too scared to fight back, he thought. What sort of coward jumps 15 feet to the ground instead of standing and fighting? A coward like me, that's what sort of coward. No wonder they're all hurling abuse at me. I deserve it. The paranormal dropped the broken weapon he was still holding, and managing to haul himself up from the ground, he turned and began to walk away in defeat. Watching him depart, Charles stood on the platform and announced loudly, "It seems that I'm the senior commander here now." No one dared to challenge him. "You all have one final chance now to withdraw," he added. "If you do, no one will stop you. But if you stay and use the military supplies, you have to accept orders from the military. On behalf of the military, I demand absolute obedience from you, even if I order you to die. If you don't want to accept my authority, you should leave now. But if you choose to stay and then disobey my orders, you'll be punished under military rules. If that happens, it won't end well for you." A murmur of dissent went through the crowd. One onlooker whispered to her friend, "Absolute obedience? We're not soldiers, so why do we have to swear absolute obedience?" Her friend muttered in reply, "He wants us to agree to die if he tells us to. That's madness." Charles looked at the crowd. "If you don't accept my demand, I'll leave you to fight by yourselves," he shouted. "What sort of place do you think this is? It's not summer camp. This is a battlefield, a war zone where we're engaged in a major battle with the zombies. If you don't even have the courage to fight me, how well do you think you'll do against the zombies?" He scanned the massive group from above, raising his voice even more so those in the back could hear him. "There's more than 2,000 of you, and yet you won't take on just me, never mind thousands of zombies," he continued. "Do you still expect the army to defend you, if you're unwilling to help your fellow countrymen in this terrible war?" He paused for a moment as his words echoed through the area, and then he said, "Now, I'm giving you one final choice. Stay and obey, or get out of here and fend for yourselves." With a few flashes of his sword, Charles reduced the platform to rubble, and after that, there was silence. Apart from the level 5 spear-type paranormal who had humiliated himself, everyone from the Super Squad decided to stay with the group in the face of Charles's demand for absolute obedience. They had all caused trouble because they had wanted to fight for better benefits and increase their status. But they knew that if they all turned tail and fled, No one would ever trust them again. Charles decided not to make things too difficult for them, so they were all assigned to defensive tasks. They became the patrol platoon dedicated to monitoring the boundary of the war zone. The new recruits heaved a collective sigh of relief when they realized they weren't going to be frontline fighters. "It seems like the new commander just wanted to prove his strength at the outset. He seems like a good guy, really," said one. "Yeah, he seems soft-hearted despite all his fighting talk," said another. Anyone who knew Charles would be laughing their head off if they had heard the recruits' conversation. No one had ever called Charles soft-hearted before. Once the new recruits had been allocated their jobs, Charles and some of his senior officers gathered in a military tent to discuss what to do next. One of the officers had produced an analysis of their current position. "As everyone saw, the longest defense line in Zone 23 is 40 miles long," the Chief of Staff said. "The longer the defense line is, the more people we need to defend it. With such a long line, we need to arrange at least 4,500 people to cover it." He drew 3 circles on the map. "Now take a look at this. We still have zones 17, 22, and 24 ahead of us. These 3 war zones are like a mountain pass blocking our way. In other words, the enemies we face will be determined by these 3 zones." Lewis smashed his fist onto the table in front of him. "This is all getting to be way too much," he said. "We're being targeted, and now we're being told to send more than 4,000 troops to defend the front line. That's half of our main fighting force. I know we had 15,000 reinforcements from Montreal, but only 9,000 of those are main force troops. There are 3 theaters of war still to engage. How are we supposed to manage all that with greatly reduced troop numbers?" The Chief of Staff continued his analysis. "If we just defend the front line, then the pressure on our numbers won't be too bad. But let's not forget the military merit system operating in Washington." He paused and looked around to make sure he still had everyone's attention. "The distribution of benefits is determined by each region's contribution to the war effort. If all the high-level zombies are killed on the front line, then all we'll have left to contribute will be low-level zombies and materials from other low-level beasts." The assembled officers were angry, and the Chief of Staff fell silent to let them have their say. "We don't want the Washington Army thinking that our contribution's second-rate, but it feels like we're being set up to fail here," said one. "It sure does," said another. "And if we do fail, we'll all be humiliated and probably demoted at the very least. Our troops are a proud group of fighters, and I don't want that to be the outcome for their sakes." But Charles had a different view of the situation. "Whatever level of zombies we kill, we'll still be able to collect crystal cores from them, which can increase our strength," he thought. "And the blood and spinal cord of any level of zombie can be used to produce genetic enhancement serum, and we know that's very valuable. Leonard is confident that he'll make a fortune from the serum, and he doesn't care how many casualties we suffer in the process. All he cares about is how much he can increase his strength and power." Leonard was the world's first Saint-level cultivator, and as well as being a very talented fighter and military leader, he'd used his power to acquire a huge amount of resources. The war had made him an absolute fortune, adding even more to his massive supply. The military needed to weigh up the possibilities of success or failure with any action, but Charles was mostly interested in the benefits the battle with Leonard could bring them all. "We have 2 main missions," said Charles. "The first is to stop any zombies breaking through our lines of defense. The second is to clear out all the zombies from the battle zones." "So I'm guessing you have some bright ideas regarding how we go about all that?" said Lewis, optimism written across his face. Charles had shown great military skills in the battle between Dawn City and Stellar Technology, so he was held in very high esteem, and his opinion was valuable in planning any campaign. One of his greatest skills was his ability to predict how the enemy would proceed, or how they would react to any assault. Coupled with his ruthlessness and decisiveness, he made a top-class military leader. Dawn City had used a massive amount of energy to build its defenses before the battle with Stellar Technology, but they hadn't even had a chance to fully test them before Charles had burned their enemies to the ground. His actions had reduced Dawn City's casualties to a great extent. The officers all looked at Charles expectantly, needing him to come up with a battle plan that was out of the ordinary, daring, and spectacular in its cunning. He stood in front of the map and drew a line on it. "If we can create an indestructible hellfire defense here, will the pressure on us be reduced?" Everyone fell silent. None of them could think of any alternative, but they had no idea where Charles was going to find enough firepower or equipment to create an indestructible defense. "Don't worry," he said confidently. "Leave this to me." "Charles, this isn't a joke," Lewis said seriously. "But if you're sure you can pull it off, we'll go with your tactics." If the Hellfire is extinguished in the middle of the battle, our rear defense line will have a huge gap in it because of you, the Chief of Staff said. If we're going to rely on a Hellfire wall to reduce the pressure on the defensive troops, any attack that damages the wall will have very serious consequences. I've built an arcane wall, explained Charles. What? Exclaimed Lewis. You're joking, right? Everyone looked shocked. They knew that an arcane wall could only be controlled by a level 7 paranormal. How'd you manage that so fast? A paranormal asked, gaping in surprise. The only way to build one is by using your soul energy. They had all built energy shields, but an arcane wall was taking things to a whole new level. Energy shields were great for defending against airborne enemies, such as plagues of insects. But there were also enemies from underground, and they needed the more powerful arcane wall to cope with those. An arcane wall could bind soul energy from the outside world, and any enemy that tried to breach the wall would be faced with something of incredible strength and defensive power. It could only be fully breached once its energy had been completely consumed, and it was so successful as a defensive measure that it would become the most common form of defense in the future. I've just built a simplified version, replied Charles, waving his hand dismissively. As long as a full-scale arcane wall doesn't come under attack, it can exist until its energy is exhausted. But the arcane wall that I've built will only last for a couple of months at most, and it will absorb any nearby soul energy, which will make the surrounding area unsuitable for farming. It does have its limitations. Charles was perfectly capable of constructing a full-scale arcane wall, but doing that consumed huge amounts of energy. Although he had accumulated a lot of crystal cores and soul energy, he couldn't afford to use them unnecessarily. It was better to have a temporary defense and for him to keep some of his resources in reserve than to use them all on a project that might not be needed. It was very unusual to hear Charles speak modestly, and his fellow officers were surprised. I didn't know it was possible to simplify the process, said one of the level 5 officers. And I couldn't work out how you could have cultivated to the extent needed to build a full-scale arcane wall. The kind of talent that could simplify exclusive level 7 abilities from level 5 was remarkable, especially when most level 5 paranormals hadn't even learned to fully control their level 5 skills. The woman who had just spoken was very jealous. Right, said Lewis. We now know it's possible to build a simplified version of an arcane wall at level 5, and we have other level 5 officers, so we should start building straight away. Lewis had great faith in Charles, and knew that he wouldn't have come up with an unworkable or reckless plan. So the meeting was suspended immediately, and they began their construction work. With Charles already being so familiar with the necessary building techniques, he taught the others quickly, and they created 2 parallel walls with a large gap between them. Charles and Anthony began to summon hellhounds using a summoning spell array, and over 20 of them appeared. The hellhounds began spitting out fire and produced a 15-yard high wall of hellfire. The Super Squad members were all shocked. What just happened? Asked one. How did he summon those creatures? Asked another. We're powerful, but we can't do that. Those monsters are level 5, a third cried. Even his pets could destroy us. The Super Squad quieted down when they realized that Charles had no need for them, and there wouldn't be any rich picking that they could loot. They watched in silence and awe as the hellhounds filled the arcane wall with hellfire that burned continuously within. Do you think we should join up with this guy? One of them said to his captain. We can't compete with someone who can just summon up a pack of hellhounds and build walls of hellfire. We're going to need someone's protection sooner or later. So maybe we should seek refuge with him. I agree, replied the captain. We can surrender quietly later on. Throughout history, the strongest people have always attracted a following. Charles's display of strength had led the Super Squad to give up their thoughts of making trouble. They wanted to seek refuge with him instead. They drifted into Charles's tent one by one, all feeling very awkward about secretly wanting to give Charles their loyalty, and finding that all of their squad mates felt just the same. Charles had expected this would happen, and had asked Tommy to maintain order. Quiet down, everybody, Tommy shouted. If you want to be with us, you need to understand that our commander works on the principle of give and take. If you want something from him, you have to be prepared to give something in return. We don't have freeloaders here. There were a few murmurs of dissatisfaction from the members of the Super Squad who weren't keen on playing a subordinate role to anyone. But feeling they had little choice in the matter, they fell silent and listened to Tommy, who had pinned an exchange list up on the board. This is a list of things you can exchange with a barter value alongside each item, he said. We're offering food, equipment, purified crystal cores, or genetic enhancement serum. What we need from you in exchange are crystal cores, the blood of mutated zombies, corpses of mutated beasts, and insect bodies. Tommy turned around and left the tent, forestalling any questions. The Super Squad members thought Tommy and Charles were very arrogant in issuing their demands and lists, and even though they weren't in any position to argue, they grumbled among themselves. What equipment could they possibly offer us? Asked one. Aren't weapons made from zombie bones and wild animals' teeth useful enough? Look at the list, said another. It says here that a sword costs 40 crystal cores. That's daylight robbery. It depends on what it's made from, replied the first. If it's made from that special dark iron like their commander's spear, then it's a worthy trade. If not, no deal. Listening to the Super Squad, Charles held up the dark iron spear that he had chopped in half with his bare hands, just to reinforce that he was strong enough to easily destroy one of the hardest-known forging materials. We'd better be careful, said a Super Squad member. If he can break that with one strike of his hand, think what he could do to us if we step out of line. Charles threw down the broken spear, then Lewis approached him. One of our scouts has just reported in, Lewis said. There are 2,000 or 3,000 zombies swarming toward our defensive line. It looks like they're a disciplined and well-organized group. Time for some action, wouldn't you say? Don't worry about them, replied Charles, much to Lewis's surprise. Let's just finish building the arcane wall. He had laid the foundations of the wall so that he and his troops could replenish their soul energy. Behind them, Charles and Lewis watched the Hellhounds spitting more flames to keep filling the space between the two walls with hellfire. When the Super Squad saw the mutated zombies amassing, they ran to the city wall and began to prepare to defend it. Some of them who hadn't been in Charles's tent had already climbed down from the wall and were getting ready to fight the zombies head-on. Okay, my friends, said one of them. It's time to show the Dawn City people what we can do. Look over there, shouted another. What sort of paranormal is that? A powerful wind-type paranormal was drenched in a cold sweat, and his face was very pale. These zombies are all at least level 3, said the paranormal. The Super Squad on the city wall fell silent for a moment, then they burst into laughter. Seriously? Are you kidding us? One said. How can there be so many level 3 zombies? The wind-type paranormal was well respected by those who knew him, so when some of the people on the ground outside the city wall heard what he said, they realized they needed to get back to the wall. Several of them ran back and climbed onto the wall, but many didn't listen to the wind-type paranormal and stayed where they were. Just then, the huge group of zombies started to run quickly toward the city wall. One zombie pounced forward, and its hands turned into sharp claws. The people who hadn't paid any attention to the wind-type paranormal were terrified and began to run, but they had waited too long to escape the zombies charging their direction. The Dawnian paranormal started to release their superpowers. Fire, ice, thorns, and wind blades flew everywhere, and some of the zombies were floored on the spot. But many more zombies from their rear lines came forward and began to fight. As soon as the Dawnian fighters began exchanging blows with the zombies, they realized that something didn't feel right. Everyone knew that zombies had tough bodies, even low-level ones, but these zombies felt like steel. Fighters using machetes saw their weapons shatter in their hands, and even some of the more powerful weapons got stuck in the zombies' bodies and couldn't be pulled back out. In an instant, those fighters who hadn't managed to climb up the city wall were on the verge of collapse under the impact of the piles of bodies fast building up. The people on the city wall were in despair. They thought their cries for help had gone unheeded, when suddenly they heard a great shout. Knights of Hell, charge! The people on the ground looked in awe at the source of the voice that had shouted, charge! One of them was distracted, staring at the knight in shiny black armor mounted on a warhorse, and he didn't see a zombie coming for him. The zombie killed him with a bite to the throat. His moment of distraction had amounted to suicide, and he fell dead. The Knights of Hell were divided into 3 mounted units, and all armed with 6-foot-long sabers. The units charged one at a time at the zombies. With every cavalry soldier that passed, more and more zombies were slashed to the ground. Their weapons had an incredible impact as the knights swiped to either side of their horses at great speed. Before the zombies could react, the second unit of the Knights of Hell charged forward, their sabers cutting through the zombies like knives through butter. When the third wave joined the battle, even the level 4 zombies couldn't slow down the onslaught, with many more being killed or badly wounded. Some zombies tried to chase after the knights, but they also fell victim to their superb swordsmanship. Mark raised his battle axe above his head and shouted, "Knights of Hell, regroup!" The knights reorganized their battle groups as quickly as they could, and then they charged again, killing many more zombies. The super squad members on the city wall were impressed, and started wondering how the knights had become so strong and so well armed. "What I want to know is how they have such strong armor," said one. "Yeah," replied another. "Is it the same armor that's on the exchange list in the tent?" "And are the knights' weapons the same as the ones on the list?" asked the first. Falling silent for a moment, the super squad members started to wonder if they could find enough things that the Dawnians wanted to exchange for much better weapons than they already had. "I think the list said that a saber costs 40 crystal cores," said one squad member. "It shouldn't be too hard to get enough crystal cores together to buy some of those." Another said to their captain, "We have some savings between us. Why don't we pool what we've got and buy some of their sabers?" "We'll soon be bankrupt if we do that," scoffed the captain. "So what?" came the reply. "Why is bankruptcy such a big deal? If the quality of their weapons is as good as it looks, it'll be worth the risk, surely." "I saw the exchange list too," said the captain. "It'd be better to exchange what we can for just one very powerful weapon. Then we can use it to kill powerful zombies. And then we can use the blood and crystal cores of the zombies we kill in exchange for the food and water we need." "Good idea," replied one of his squad. "Their commander told us we could exchange anything of value with him, so some crystal cores and zombie blood should speed an exchange along very nicely. And some of the zombies are level 5, so with a combination of our captain's strength and a really great quality weapon, we should be able to kill level 5 zombies. Their blood and crystal cores are very valuable." Some of the super squad teams weren't thrilled by the plan, but others had already decided to go along with the captain's idea. Even if they exhausted the entire team's accumulated resources, they still wanted to buy a special saber. Meanwhile, the Knights of Hell were still fighting. By the time they had charged and regrouped 7 times, they had killed half of the zombies, and the rest of the zombies had been scattered across the battlefield. A lot of very badly injured zombies were on the ground, screaming in pain. After the 7th charge, Mark ordered, "Begin harvesting!" The knights slowed their horses and started to harvest zombie blood, bones, and crystal cores. They were joined by Miranda's team of paranormals, and even the logistics team was roped in to help remove the most useful parts from the zombie bodies with some specialist equipment. The Dawnian people were all hardworking. They all knew that if they wanted to eat and stay safe, they had to learn battle procedures early on and help the warriors who fought on the battlefield to clean up the war zones after a fight. Some of the less severely injured zombies tried to attack Miranda's team of paranormals, but soon discovered they were even stronger than the cavalry. The paranormals were also armed with top-quality daggers, so the zombie attack was short-lived and unsuccessful. The battlefield cleanup was part of Charles's training program for the paranormals and the logistics team. Paranormals usually fought from a distance, but they still needed to practice how to deal with enemies at close range. During the cleanup, if anyone from Dawn City encountered danger, Helen would immediately send Hellthorns to carry the injured people away and treat them. Very soon, there were only Dawnians left on the battlefield. All the zombies had been killed, and their crystal cores, blood, and useful body parts were harvested. "Operation Burn!" shouted Mark, and the fire element paranormals began to shoot flames, burning the entire battlefield. The super squad members on the city wall looked across the battlefield enviously at the strange light coming from the burning ground. Their captain said, "If only we could become part of that organization. How great would that be?" After the battle, the Knights of Hell took stock. Some of them had been injured, but none of those injuries had been fatal. Calvin could regenerate flesh and blood, which was a useful skill. Although it would still be some time before he would be able to regrow broken bones, he was already able to heal injuries that otherwise would have been fatal. And he could always use zombie serum to save those who had been bitten by zombies. But even so, there had still been 3 unavoidable casualties. For those 3 people, the zombie virus had already penetrated deep into their brains before there had been a chance to inject them with the zombie serum. It had been too late, so their fellow knights had had to execute them. Not very many of the knights had seemed sad about that, perhaps because they had grown numb to people around them dying. The Knights of Hell cheered. "We won!" Not only did their victory mean they would get a lot of plunder, but it also proved their worth. Charles had invested his time and energy to arm them, and their display of power during the battle had shown that their equipment had been worth it. The gains from the battle were enormous. They had acquired 2,200 crystal cores from level 3 zombies and over 300 crystal cores from level 4 zombies. But some of the loot from the battle seemed to have gone missing. Harper asked several people about the missing crystal cores. "If the logistics team has stashed some bones, we can ignore that," she said. "But crystal cores and mutated blood absolutely cannot be hidden. We have to investigate this thoroughly." When the logistics team had picked through the battlefield, some of them had secretly pocketed some items. It didn't matter much when those items weren't worth a lot, especially shells or feathers. Finding things like that would only increase their enthusiasm. But they weren't allowed to keep crystal cores or mutated blood. Those were the spoils of war, trophies for the soldiers who had fought on the front lines. People who had given their lives for those valuable items, and it was seen as greedy to exchange them for money. "No, that's not possible," said a paranormal working under Miranda, looking at a form. "We followed the mayor's instructions and have logged every crystal core higher than a level 4. They're all recorded." "Who would anyone trade them with anyway? There's no way they could hide it from us, unless they used a level 5 crystal core to obtain another one." Anyone above level 4 could sense the aura of the crystal cores. Someone might have been able to hide a weak crystal core, but there was no way to hide a powerful one without some sort of special ability or method. Harper nodded. "I understand," she said, preparing to report back to Charles. A wind-type paranormal spoke up. "When the zombie wave broke out, we discovered that even the weakest of them were level 3. But because powerful energies interfere with each other, there's one thing we were confused about." "What's that?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment. "It's likely that there were no level 5s in the horde of zombies we fought this time." They had fought countless battles alongside Charles on the way there from Dawn City, deliberately provoking zombies many times in order to train. They had become quite skilled with their hands and were very familiar with their enemy, which was why there had been so few casualties in their latest battle. Charles didn't react much when he heard the news, but he had a guess about what it meant. "Mutated zombies can summon the zombies around them," he said. "And when these mutated zombies have reached level 5, some of them can even control other zombies and arrange them in formations, just like we saw with the tentacular cadavers. But what if the low-level zombies have grown stronger with help from an even more powerful force?" "Maybe this is all just a test," Miranda said, frowning. "But it's quite the move to sacrifice 3,000 level 3 zombies for a test." "You're not wrong, but it has to be more than that," Charles said. He thought for a moment and offered another theory. "Most zombies aren't as intelligent as humans. Even if they can sometimes make coordinated attacks, they're still dumber than us. Without human input, they wouldn't be able to come up with a brilliant strategy. Take the tentacular cadaver, for example. There's no doubt that it's intelligent, but it isn't equal to human intellect. Without a puppet master controlling it, the tentacular cadaver is nothing but a powerful fighter. A human military general wouldn't be quite as decisive as it is, but they would at least choose a more suitable tactic, such as an ambush." Everyone fell into deep thought. If they were facing brainless beasts, they wouldn't be afraid no matter how many there were. But if there was a type of zombie out there with enough intelligence not only to organize troops, but also to employ military tactics, then they were in trouble. What was even more terrifying was that this unknown zombie had sacrificed 3,000 level 3 zombies just to test its strategy out. "There's no need to think too much about it," Charles said, trying to comfort everyone. "Nothing can change its nature. In the end, the zombies are still just zombies, not humans. They can try to play tricks on us, but that only reveals their own weaknesses." Over the next 2 days, they finished building the arcane wall. With such a large supply of crystal cores, it didn't take long, and Anthony's hellhounds had no choice but to take a day off after they finished spewing their hellfire within the formation. While everyone worked on the wall, mutated zombies attacked them constantly, but it was nothing the Super Squad paranormals couldn't handle. They had traded for more than 50 dark iron weapons from Charles, but it had cost them nearly all the powerful resources they had accumulated. Despite the expense, they were excited to try the weapons out and risk their lives killing zombies to get back what they had lost. Charles agreed to their request to go out and hunt zombies freely, but he only allowed those who had dark iron weapons to leave on the hunt. Everyone else was unhappy with his decision, but he gave them a perfectly acceptable excuse. "You don't even have decent weapons," he said. "Do you want to die hunting zombies?" It's better to keep working here until you have enough wealth to exchange for the proper weapons. Everyone who didn't have enough to exchange for weapons, yet could only watch in resentment as those who had dark iron weapons took advantage of the night and hunted zombies to earn even more wealth. With so many crystal cores, there should be enough for Miranda to advance to level 6, Charles thought excitedly, as he surveyed the stash the Super Squad had traded for weapons and goods. After he took his share of the crystal cores, he started thinking about how to distribute the rest. Tommy, Tina, and Hugh had already used a lot of crystal cores and had reached level 5. Their strength had greatly increased, and they all possessed blood-refining weapons, which made them even stronger than ordinary level 5s. They had earned a place fighting at Charles's side. Instead of doling out the crystal cores immediately, he gathered all the level 5s for a meeting. "I think everyone here has learned that there are a lot of secrets to being a level 5, he said. "Simply raising your level doesn't necessarily improve your strength." He looked at Zach. "You know that better than anyone." Zach nodded. "That's right. Since I've reached level 5, my soul energy is purer, and I can store more energy than before. But even though my strength has improved, it hasn't increased as much as it did when I reached previous levels." A gleaming fire snake appeared beside him. "But if I can grasp the secrets of level 5 and use the fire snake with my true fire, that'll be far more reliable than trying to further increase the soul energy in my body. After all, in a fight to the death, wearing your opponent down doesn't matter. All that matters is killing them first." Everyone nodded in agreement. The amount of soul energy a person could store was only meaningful to people like Charles. It was almost impossible for him to fail as long as his soul energy wasn't depleted. But for most people, if they were weaker than their opponent, they could be killed before they had a chance to attack, and then there would be no point to having more soul energy stored in their bodies. "Think of it this way," Zach continued. "A zombie's physical strength far surpasses that of a human, but it's still not really a match for a human of the same level." "So, combat strength is more important than level," Harper said. In real life, battles weren't simple, and they rarely started off on even footing. Even a level 5 would die if a level 3 was able to slice their throat. But there were very few people who had the speed and reaction time to defeat people above their level. Charles said, "Since everyone here has already reached level 5, your focus should be on increasing your physical strength and unleashing the potential might of your superpowers, rather than trying to raise your overall level. We need to use most of the crystal cores to nurture only a few people, like Zach and Miranda." Zach rubbed his nose, and his cheeks warmed in embarrassment. "Are you sure it should be me?" "Now's not the time to be modest," Charles answered with a shake of his head. "We need to consider the maximum combat strength of the team. The strongest people have to take on the most difficult tasks. If you were facing your most powerful enemy, would you want someone else to handle them instead?" "Of course not. I'll do it, and I won't give up," Zach said firmly. Anthony, Calvin, and the others agreed with him. They had all fought side by side since the first day of the apocalypse. They lived and died together, and they were closer to each other than to their families. They'd always had each other's backs, and they weren't about to stop doing that. Charles had made his decision. "All right, we'll concentrate our crystal cores on helping Zach and Miranda advance to level 6. The rest of you will have to rely on your own cultivation. Once they've broken through, we'll focus on Anthony next, then Calvin, and then Dale." Although Dale was last in line, he didn't mind. "You guys have to protect me until I can level up," he joked. Miranda's gaze landed on Tina, Tommy, and Hugh. "Why aren't they on your list?" she asked Charles. "We've seen how strong they are. They're just as strong as elemental paranormals." In the previous battle, although the Knights of Hell had stolen the show, Tina, Tommy, and Hugh had performed well. They had killed many high-level enemies in just one move. They already had powerful weapons, and if they increased even one level, they would be able to fight for a long time. But Charles shook his head. "They're special. I have my own plans for them." No one asked any more questions, and Tina, Tommy, and Hugh didn't disagree. They knew how talented they were, and they also knew that it was only because of Charles's gift that they possessed such skill in the first place. They wouldn't argue about anything he arranged for them. They relied on him too much. Charles waved his hand. "Since it's decided, I'll leave you some crystal cores we recovered after the battle. I'll use the rest to start increasing my strength at full speed. There's no shortage of crystal cores right now." Olivia and Miranda had more than 50 paranormals on their team, and they had all reached the peak of level 4 with the help of the crystal cores. The energy consumption of the level 5 hurdles was sometimes too great, and people sometimes wasted a lot of crystal cores without breaking through. But the level 4s couldn't have improved so quickly without the crystal cores. Charles had sold the dark iron weapons and had earned enough crystal cores to support everyone around him, and those who were strong enough could obtain more crystal cores. He gave preferential treatment to his inner circle. He let them increase their strength, and then they could use that strength to obtain more wealth to give back to him. No wonder Leonard turned all of Maryland into a paradise for zombies, Charles thought. Crystal cores are really beneficial. But that thought stopped him cold. A chill ran down his spine. In his previous life, no one had known the cause of the apocalypse. But at that moment, he came to a terrifying conclusion. He muttered to himself, could these crystal cores be the reason the zombies appeared? Is it possible that the apocalypse was fabricated by people looking to harvest them? Is there something on your mind again? Alice asked, leaning into Charles's arms. She could tell he was thinking about something that he didn't want to say out loud. It's nothing, he insisted. Then he changed the topic. You need to practice controlling your energy. Every time your emotions fluctuate, the gate of hell inside your body gets stronger. I've helped strengthen the seal on it, but that can only help so much. You have to rely on your own strength to completely control the gate. Alice nodded. So you're worried about me? It warmed her heart to know that, despite his hardened exterior, Charles actually cared about people. Yes, of course I am, he said. He didn't usually go out of his way to make people happy, but he was gentle with Alice. After all, his guess about what might happen was just that, a guess. The arcane wall had been roughly completed. The 3rd Division of Montreal had left behind a defense team of 2,000 people as the main force, and 1,000 more as an auxiliary. The rest of the troops had been sent out to kill the enemy. Charles's Knights of Hell also went out to fight zombies every day, and then they defended the gap in the arcane wall at night. This went on for 5 days, during which supplies came from Washington twice. Large amounts of food and water were sent over, as well as many heavy machine guns. Ordinary machine guns were no longer a threat to the zombies. The nuclear bomb had killed all the weak zombies, and nearly all the ones who had survived were mutated zombies. Only heavy machine guns were enough to hinder them. Hugh, Tina, and Tommy were immersed in the work of killing zombies every day, too. Even at night, they were unwilling to stop, frequently fighting over defense duty with the super squads. But with Charles behind them, no one objected to their activities. Elsewhere, a uniformed soldier entered a military tent and addressed Leonard, a handsome man in white armor sitting on a chair in front of him. Sir, we have the results, the soldier reported. For the past few days, Warzone 23 has been ranked 24. Leonard touched the arm of the chair and asked calmly, Timothy, do you think I'm an idiot? Of course not, Timothy stammered, lowering his head and averting his eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his face. Then tell me, if they can build an arcane wall, how in the world did they rank 24th? Leonard stood up, marched over, and got in Timothy's face. Are you saying that after they built the arcane wall, they would just hide behind it and not go out to hunt zombies? Or do you think our soldiers are really too strong for them, and that none of them are weaker than the soldiers in Montreal? I'm sorry, sir, Timothy said, starting to shake. I just wanted to share your burden and help you humiliate them. Leonard shoved him backward and shouted, Oh, really? Do you think everyone else is blind or stupid? That they won't see this as a disgrace? Let me tell you, once this ranking is announced, there will be consequences. Everyone will think that I'm a petty and despicable man who deliberately messed with the rankings in order to embarrass someone else. A middle-aged man named Owen walked into the tent. All right, Leonard, that's enough, he said. He only wants to lighten your load. You should reward him for his loyalty, not punish him as if he's done something wrong. Timothy had stumbled back against the tent wall when Leonard had pushed him. He looked terrified of what Leonard might do next. Leonard scoffed. I've already given him a reward for his loyalty, Uncle Owen. But now that he's made a mistake, why shouldn't he be punished? I don't need a cheerleader, he said disdainfully. Owen shook his head and smiled bitterly. Clearly, he was used to Leonard's attitude. "The true ranking of Montreal's army should be 7th place," Owen said. "Things haven't gotten bad enough yet for them to threaten us. Should we give up on our plan? If we deliberately target them, it'll have a huge impact on what we do next." They hadn't planned on the reinforcements that had arrived from Montreal. Since the Montreal forces weren't as terrifying as they had imagined, they felt there was no need to target them. The fact that they were ranked 7th indicated that their strength was only slightly above average. "Some things aren't as simple as they seem," Leonard said. He took out a report and handed it to Owen. "We mainly rely on unpurified crystal cores to calculate the number of casualties. Then we proceed with a unified purification. That way, each of the crystal cores can only be recorded once. It's been a reasonable approach. Even if someone cheated and took out crystal cores, they've already been recorded. But you all overlooked the problem." "What problem?" Owen asked. "It's difficult to increase your ranking, but it's not that hard to decrease it," Leonard said seriously. "If they're hiding their true strength, then this report won't help us deduce how strong they really are." Owen laughed in disbelief. Hiding their strength? Their contribution directly determines how many supplies they get, not to mention their reputation. I might believe that they're using a conservative strategy, but how is it to their benefit to hide their strength? The Montreal army had come all the way to Washington to provide support. Of course, Washington had to bear the burden of providing supplies as payment for that support. Otherwise, the reinforcements from Montreal wouldn't dare to risk their lives to help them. Even Leonard wouldn't cheap out in that regard. But the amount of supplies they got depended on how desperate they were. "What about the number of casualties?" Leonard asked. He drew 3 circles on the report. "Over the past 5 days, they've killed more than 20,000 zombies. But they've only lost 29 people. The remaining casualties all belong to the Super Squad." Owen narrowed his eyes. "Do you think the Montreal army passed off their losses to the Super Squad?" he asked Leonard. "That could be the case," Leonard replied. "If they hand all their dangerous tasks to them, it makes sense the squad suffered the bulk of the casualties. If that's the case, we can use this to damage their reputation." Using the Super Squad to tarnish the Montreal army's reputation was all part of Leonard's plan. If the army's ranking was high, Leonard and his men would publicize it as only being possible due to the Super Squad's contribution. And if the ranking was low, then it would seem like the army was useless, no matter how many reinforcements came to help them. The army only had 29 casualties at that time, whereas the Super Squad had 2,000, which was 1/10 of their force. These results made it seem like the army hadn't put their lives on the line like the Super Squad had, and it could even be said that they had used the Super Squad as fodder just to increase their ranking. People would say whatever they wanted about it, and Owen knew it was possible they were already doing so. "It'd be great if that was the case," Leonard said. "But according to the information we've gathered, everyone in the Super Squad is eager to go out and kill zombies. They don't care about the casualties at all." He sat back in his chair and drummed his fingers on the arm. "Let's use our spies to investigate their secrets." "It's not easy to train and communicate with each spy," Owen protested. "Also, that region is airtight. The military interrupts all our attempts to communicate. None of the spies we previously arranged for the Super Squad had the chance to deliver their messages. Sending more spies might do more harm than good." Training spies might not have been that difficult, but maintaining their loyalty was. And because of the communication hiccups, it would be hard to keep in touch with the spies. They primarily used radios to communicate, but those were very easy to intercept. Wind-type paranormals even had a detection ability similar to radar, which meant any spies had no chance at all to send secret messages when they were around. Leonard screwed up his face in disgust. "If you can't pass messages along, then what good are they? Spies are meant to be sacrificed. If the Montreal army is too airtight, then find a way to get at Charles instead. The civilian forces are the weakest in guarding against spies. We'll get the army's complete combat plan from him." Owen gave him an appraising look. Leonard was the most outstanding member of the Shaw family. Though he was young, his talent and determination were the best in the family. His only flaw was that he seemed indifferent to the value of life. But in the post-apocalyptic world, that attitude didn't always seem like a flaw. The Shaw family's plans depended on Leonard's leadership. Otherwise, they were doomed to fail. Since Leonard had given the order, Owen had no choice but to obey. And with a nod, he set the plan into motion. In a military council tent in Warzone 23, Charles met with the Chief of Staff of the Montreal Army. The Chief of Staff smiled and asked, "How can you ask us to take only 1/3 of the credit? The entire army will be humiliated." Charles raised his eyebrows. "Are you going to compensate us then?" "What are you talking about?" the Chief of Staff asked. "We're practically a family. We're brothers in arms who live and die together. How can we talk about compensation?" He wanted to remind Charles of their relationship, but not knowing if Charles was serious, he didn't dare press him too far. Even if the military only considered the price of the equipment Charles had provided, they knew he had already done them a huge favor by giving them a 60% discount on it. And since they had gladly accepted this favor, they felt they didn't have the right to question where such powerful and plentiful equipment had come from. Charles had also shown them his refining skills. In no time at all, he could turn their money into dark iron weapons. They thought if he spent 6 hours forging weapons every day, he would be able to forge at least 200 of them in short order. But the refining and forging of dark iron were two completely different things. Even a dark dwarf could only make 20 to 30 weapons each day. A portion of the soldiers had to be allocated to refine and prepare the dark iron for the weapon forging to proceed properly. "We already discussed this before we arrived," Charles said. "I won't interfere with specific commands, but I have the highest authority to make decisions for the army. I want you all to help me carry out an operation." This announcement made everyone worry. They were willing to trust Charles because he had established Dawn City. His city not only provided shelter for hundreds of thousands of people, but it also paved a path of survival through the apocalypse for countless others. Anyone who felt lost in the post-apocalyptic world knew to go to Dawn City, where they could find the meaning of survival. Word had spread throughout the southern military region, and even the people in Butte regarded Dawn City as a legendary place. But that didn't mean that the person who had built it was a good person. With everyone on tenterhooks, Charles gestured at the map and said, "The biggest threat to Warzone 23 is Baltimore. I want to destroy that place in one go and make that threat disappear." Everyone was shocked into silence. Lewis's eyes widened. In one go? How is that possible? Baltimore was hit by a nuclear bomb. There are countless mutated zombies there, and it's too dangerous for us to fight them at night. It'll be a slaughter. Human vision was greatly hindered at night, so the zombies ruled the darkness. Humans usually only engaged in battle at night to defend themselves, never to attack. They preferred to fight during the day. It wasn't that they were afraid to die, but if they were going to die, they wanted their sacrifice to be worth it. Fighting during the day gave them a greater chance of survival and allowed them to kill more zombies, so they had no reason to choose to fight at night. Charles's face remained impassive as he said, "What if I told you that I know how to get rid of our limitations during night battles?" After the military meeting ended, Charles returned to his tent. Alice was teaching her brother how to adapt to the dangers of the world around them. Although she might not have been the best teacher, the 12-year-old boy was eager to learn. Meanwhile, Miranda and the others oversaw the patrols. In the past few days, they had captured a lot of Super Squad members who had tried to send secret messages and hadn't even tried to explain themselves. It was clear that they weren't professional spies. Every time they sent messages to their superiors, they hid in a corner, afraid that someone would discover them. But that only made them more conspicuous. Of course, just because someone was acting shady didn't necessarily mean they were a spy. And some of them had originally been true members of the Super Squad. But they had been offered money to send covert messages to the enemy. They hadn't undergone any sort of training and didn't have any professional means of transmitting information, so they were terrified that they would be discovered. A few people in the camp had gone missing after they had been caught, but nobody panicked about it. There were casualties in the defensive battles every night, and it was hardly noticeable if a few more people didn't return. Besides, Charles's people were the ones who recorded the casualties. If someone's death record stated that they had been ambushed by zombies or bugs and had then been cremated, no one dared to question it. Even their teammates didn't doubt the report. Anyone who left their team and went to a secluded spot was liable to be ambushed by zombies. Everyone knew that if they wandered off alone, they risked death. I told everyone not to go off by themselves, Harper said. Why doesn't anyone listen? We just had 2 more people wander off alone. They were killed by bugs, although no one saw it happen. We killed the bugs, but it doesn't matter. Those people are still dead, and another amateur spy is gone. Charles nodded. Intelligence work wasn't easy to do, especially without professional training, but he didn't think his enemy would send professional spies over. He was in his tent refining crystal cores and condensing extract amulets when the scent of a fragrant perfume washed over him. He looked up to see that a tall, slim woman with long hair had entered his tent. She walked right up to him and sat in his lap. After wrapping her arms around his neck, she leaned close, her warm breath tickling his ear. Charles, your refining skills really are something, she whispered seductively. Anyone with a weapon of yours cuts through the zombies like they're nothing. I'm jealous. Speak plainly, he said, keeping his face blank. I want one. She wrapped her slender legs around his waist and murmured, I'll trade you for it. Charles was surprised by her directness. He looked her up and down. She had a unique kind of beauty, and her long, slender legs drew his attention. He wanted nothing more than to grant her request. But he gave her a teasing smile and said, And what makes you think I'll be willing to give you such a powerful weapon? The woman clenched her jaw with resentment. She knew she was beautiful, and she was also quite strong. Countless men had pursued her, and many more desired her, even if they made no moves. She couldn't believe Charles wasn't instantly falling under her spell like the others always did. As for the value of the weapon she was asking for, she saw through Charles's ruse. At least 500 people under him had a dark iron sword, and everyone who went out to fight zombies had one too. The weapons weren't nearly as precious as he would have people believe. Even so, Charles had a monopoly on dark iron. He was the only source of it, so he could make a fortune by selling it even in small quantities. The woman wouldn't let him derail her mission. She tightened her legs around him and said in a luring tone, Because I'm irresponsible. Her charms had worked on many men, and it was no different with Charles. His heart pounded in his chest. But before he could react, the tent flap opened, and Helen walked in. When she saw the woman in his lap, Helen shot him an annoyed look, threw up her hands, and left. What a scumbag, she huffed, stomping back to her tent. I've been with him all this time, but he's never made a move on me. Not once. What gives? She didn't seem happy, the woman on Charles's lap said. She giggled and covered her mouth. But at least you won't be lonely tonight. Charles wrapped his arms around the woman and pulled her closer. I don't know what kind of weapon you want. I want a sword. But right now, I'd settle for your spear, she said provocatively. Charles patted the ground, and a barrier rose, keeping anyone from entering the tent. Sparks flew as the two of them came together. A while later, the woman got dressed and held up the sword Charles had given her. She flicked it lightly and made a satisfied noise. It's a good sword, she said. It has a uniform texture and a clear sound. If there weren't so many other swords like this, I would have thought it was one of a kind. The ability to make such a fantastic sword was the sign of a master. It was the highest compliment she could have given him. He shrugged. If you come to Dawn City, you'll see that this kind of weapon is very common. The woman didn't ask any more questions. She took the dark iron sword and left the tent. Once she was gone, Charles tried to rationalize his actions. I'm not a scumbag, he whispered to himself. I just admire beauty and respect a good scheme. It had been clear since the apocalypse had begun that people would need to do whatever it took to survive. With food, water, and shelter hard to come by, and riches scarce, people had become accustomed to exploiting any advantage to make sure they didn't starve. Sometimes they managed it through bribery and flattery, and sometimes through more physical means. Charles was hardly ignorant that this was the case, and he knew that the mysterious woman had deliberately seduced him to get what she had wanted from him. In the New World Order, it wasn't rare for somebody to use their talents of seduction to lower the guard of another and strike when their target was at their weakest, whether it meant robbing or even killing them, before escaping into the night. Although he didn't believe that the woman had intended to assassinate him, he couldn't rule out that she had other nefarious motives. Her praise of his dark iron sword, for example, had seemed to be a blatant attempt to win his favor. By that point in time, dark iron was nowhere near as valuable as it had been even a few weeks before. He had sold so much of it that it wasn't uncommon to pass an average person on the street wearing dark iron armor or carrying a dark iron weapon. Have I attracted unwanted attention? He wondered, realizing that despite his attempts to lay low, he had potentially put his enemies on high alert. But he consoled himself with the knowledge that if anyone tried to attack or deceive him again, he was ready for them. So much of life had become merely transactional since the beginning of the apocalypse. He had used others for his own gain on many occasions, so he knew that he shouldn't be surprised if someone else did the same to him. Helen came to his door, a disappointed look on her face, clearly piecing together from the general disarray of his room what had taken place during the night. He spotted her suspicious look and sighed. She was a spy, he said. She came trying to get information. A spy? Asked Helen. And you spent the night together? Surely you could have spent it with any number of women. Is that what you think of me? He asked. That I'm only interested in chasing after countless women? Said Helen, shrugging and deciding not to elaborate. How can you think that? He asked. Just think how long you've been by my side. Have I ever acted inappropriately to you? She clenched her fists, enraged by his total lack of self-awareness and respect. But she knew that it was useless to argue with him on the topic. She took a deep breath and released her fists. I've been by his side for so long, she thought, and he hasn't even looked twice at me. And then this other lady turns up and he runs into bed with her at the first opportunity. She shook her head. You're unbelievable, she said before leaving. Charles tried to cast the conversation from his mind and figure out what to do next. He knew that he couldn't hide the events of the night from anyone who decided to pry. It was clear that the woman had been a spy of Leonard's, which showed him that Leonard had already taken an interest in his movements. He put it down to the proliferation of his dark iron equipment. It was bound to turn some heads sooner or later, he thought. From his experience in his previous life, he knew that the Montreal military would soon stumble across their own rich supply of dark iron ore, and his stranglehold over the weapons and armor market would end. It was inevitable that a greater supply would cause the price to drop, but he had already made a small fortune from it. By his prices, 1,000 dark iron swords had fetched 24,000 level 3 crystal cores. When it came to selling to the super squad, he wasn't obliged to give them the same discount as he allowed the military, so he had acquired many more cores from them. However, considering that the squad had a close working relationship with the army, he had allowed them to pay on credit for the time being. He knew that they would pay him back in time. The sheer number of zombies in the area meant they would certainly have no problems coming by enough crystal cores. In their most recent battles, they had even killed quite a few level 5 zombies. One crystal core from such a high-powered zombie was worth 80 cores from a level 3 zombie, while the spinal cords of level 5 zombies were also very valuable. In all then, every level 5 zombie provided resources equal to 150 level 3 cores. They'd already killed 35 level 5 zombies in the past few days. Those alone had allowed the squad to pay back 20% of the credit they owed him, without even accounting for the level 4 zombies they had killed, which were also very valuable. In a way, the super squad and the army were almost running his business for him. They gave him a steady customer base, as they were well aware of how valuable and reliable dark iron equipment was in battle. Dark iron weapons weren't like ordinary weapons, the strength of which dulled with usage. They were particularly resilient to wear and so were very expensive. Both at that point and in the future, dark iron equipment would be a valuable investment, with Charles making an incredible profit from it. His riches were part of the reason he had the time and energy to encourage Miranda and Zach to reach level 6 as quickly as they could. He was able to use his great number of crystal cores to build his strength, so that he had plenty of energy for training. Meanwhile, the Super Squad saw Charles as nothing more than a cold-hearted businessman. They begged him for a discount, but he refused. As far as he was concerned, everyone knew how useful dark iron was in battle, so they had to be prepared to pay a steep price for it. If they needed proof, he only needed to point them to the soldiers who had used his equipment, who returned from the war zones laden with crystal cores from the zombies they had killed. These teams did more advertising than any well-thought-out marketing campaign would have. The great treasures that the soldiers brought back even piqued the interest of many who had had no interest in battle. If the soldiers were bringing home such a bounty, others wondered if they themselves might do so too. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the soldiers from Montreal were ready to go. Charles rode his nightmare horse, which he had called Bullet, to the front of the troop. "Onward to the front line," he cried out. At that command, 6,000 elite soldiers led by Charles and his Knights of Hell began their march. On the way, the military looked enviously at the Daunians riding on horseback. When the two teams had first met, the army had asked how much the horses would cost. "These two-horned horses come from Hell," Charles had told them. "First, you need to go down to Hell with some summoners. Then each member of your party needs to make a blood offering to sign a contract between species. This will subdue the horses, and then you'll be able to summon them at will." The army quickly dropped the idea of obtaining the horses, realizing that they would never have the courage or knowledge to properly navigate the rituals of Hell. Charles had told them almost everything about his understanding of the place, although he hadn't broached the subject of the gates of Hell. They believed everything he said and regarded him as some kind of sorcerer with knowledge they would never possess. After hearing his explanation of how to obtain the two-horned horses, the soldiers were less than enthusiastic to obtain any for themselves, knowing full well just how dangerous a place like Hell was and the sacrifices they would have to make to traverse it. "All well and good for him," one soldier said to another. "He's so powerful that he doesn't need to worry about the same things as us. Of course he finds it easier to go on such madcap missions." The soldiers were naturally more careful with their lives, although they weren't averse to sacrificing themselves in other ways. In their opinion, acting too carelessly constituted a betrayal of those they were meant to protect. In any case, they decided that riding on a nightmare horse made sense for somebody as powerful as Charles. For the rest of them, it was safer to ride in their armored vehicles. Charles knew that it would be risky to give the military the full knowledge of initiating a contract between species. As soon as a few of the soldiers tried it, the others would want to join in too. Before long, they would lose all focus and discipline. Then, of course, there was also the threat to their lives posed by exposure to the ways of Hell. Although the horses would be very useful, the benefits were outweighed by the risk of things going wrong. He didn't entirely rule out the possibility of teaching them more about Hell when his own knowledge had improved. By that point, it would improve his chances in battle if more of his allies were riding two-horned horses, and as far as he was concerned, anything that might make him stronger couldn't be entirely dismissed. However, he would have to bear in mind that making deals in Hell might go against the moral code of some of the soldiers. After an hour and a half of marching, they arrived at their destination, and Charles met with the Chief of Staff. "What's our strategy for the next battle?" the chief asked. According to Charles's agreement with the military, although he wouldn't give direct orders to the army, he needed to be the one to decide the strategy. "We need to make sure we're putting up a good defense," he said. "Anthony, send out the ordinary soldiers first." Anthony's eyes lit up. In the past, he had preferred to fight in hand-to-hand combat, but since their expedition to Hell, he had come to prefer summoning his hellhounds whenever he could. They were so useful that any other tactic seemed like a waste. Within an instant, he summoned 9 hellhounds. Charles summoned over a dozen more. At his order, the hounds began to spew hellfire in the direction of some nearby buildings. The flames engulfed more than a dozen of the buildings, including 2 shopping malls and a supermarket. Charles wasn't concerned about damaging the food inside. The area was so heavily irradiated that it would have been useless to them anyway. In fact, the entire area was so blighted by radiation that he had no qualms about razing the entire place to the ground. His plan began to work. Within minutes, crowds of zombies began stumbling out of the burning buildings and toward the army, like hornets smoked out of their nest. Miranda, Tina, and the other Daunians rushed forward, killing huge swaths of the zombies. The military commanders shook their heads bitterly to see the paranormals lead the fight. They consoled themselves that they would show the worth of their own forces soon enough. They had numbers on their side and would have many opportunities later on to earn their credit. As the zombies continued pouring out of the burning buildings in huge numbers, they quickly ordered their soldiers to provide cover fire for the paranormals. The soldiers fired, taking down hundreds of the monsters. The Chief of Staff shook his head. "How can there be so many of them?" he asked. Charles had only burned a dozen or so buildings, yet nearly 1,000 zombies in total had come out. The chief wondered if there had always been so many of them hiding in the buildings, and if they somehow didn't need to leave in order to hunt. If that was the case, it would mean that the military's estimation of the total number of zombies across the country was a vast underestimation. "There's one thing I don't understand," said Lewis, also looking worried. "When we arrived, we hardly turned up in secret. There were loads of us, making all sorts of noise. Why did it take fire to flush the zombies out?" The others around him frowned, considering his point. They all agreed it was strange the zombies hadn't reacted when they had first arrived. "Has anyone investigated the other areas hit by nuclear weapons?" asked Charles. "No," said the chief of staff. "There are so many zombies that we've been on the defensive since we got here. Plus, we haven't had the right protection to stay long in the radiation areas. So no, this is the first time we've been able to counterattack in a radiation zone." "Actually," a young officer said, "it's not the very first time. According to what one of the other divisions has been saying, General Shaw brought some of his elite paranormals into a radiation zone. It's part of the reason he got his fearsome reputation." "That Leonard is something else," said the chief of staff, smiling with admiration. In general, the soldiers had had a negative impression of Leonard up to that point. After all, as soon as they had arrived in the area, they'd been given a hard time by Leonard's people. But more recently, they had heard several stories that had inspired some admiration for him. "If Leonard's been in the radiation zone," said Charles, "then I'm going in too. While I'm gone, prepare yourselves for a long fight. I'm going into the very center, right to ground zero." "You can't," said the chief of staff. "It's too dangerous." "You have to remember it isn't just your life on the line," said Anthony. "We're all counting on you too. If something happens to you, we'll all be lost." The others in Charles's group chimed in with similar warnings. "You need to be careful." "Yeah, better to take things slow." "We know you're strong, but this is suicide." They were very keen not to lose their leader. If anything happened to him, they knew that Dawn City would crumble. "If you want to go," said Miranda, "then take me with you." Alice was about to speak, but closed her mouth. Charles looked at Miranda. "Okay," he said. "You can come with me." The other Dawnians were relieved to hear that Miranda would accompany Charles. They knew that if he wasn't sure they would get out in one piece, he wouldn't have let her join him. "I've tamed a nightmare horse too," said Zach. "Let me come." Harper looked at him nervously, but couldn't think of what to say that might change his mind. "No," said Charles. "We're only going to gather information. Although as an elemental paranormal, you're more powerful than a bio-altered paranormal. Your reaction speed is still too slow. Besides, you haven't had control of a nightmare horse for very long, and you don't even know how to ride one properly." Harper sighed in relief. Zach looked a little bashful, but didn't want to argue in case Charles started to think of him as an annoyance. He knew that while Charles could be cold and a little blunt, he always had the best interests of his followers at heart. "Besides," said Charles, "soon enough, things will be just as dangerous out here as in there." He paused a few moments before continuing. "I have a few guesses about what we'll find in there. If it's anything like our time in hell, the slightest misstep could alert the enemy to us. So you need to stay on alert outside." Everyone nodded, showing that they understood. Charles and Miranda summoned their horses, which they named Bullet and Lightning, respectively. Once they had saddled up, they shot away, gone in an instant. In the moments after they had left, the people left behind wondered if they too could travel that fast if they were able to tame a nightmare horse. Some distance away, a lone level 5 zombie wandered the streets. In one moment, it shuffled mindlessly from side to side. In the next, a dark blur sped past, and the zombie collapsed to the ground, decapitated. Slower enemies didn't stand a chance against a rider on a nightmare horse. Charles didn't have time to put the zombie's body in the energy storage space as he went by, but he tied its head to Bullet's saddle. Before they had gone much further, zombies began to surge from the buildings on both sides of the street. The radiation had disfigured them so horrifically that some of them didn't look even slightly human. If regular zombies represented a blight on human evolution, at least they still resembled people. In that part of the city, though, the zombies bore no resemblance with their origin species, their bodies covered in tumors and growths, advancing on all fours or dragging themselves supine along the ground. Charles and Miranda had no interest in fighting them. Instead, they raced to the center of the area to ground zero. the landscape around them became more and more devastated. The buildings had turned to rubble, and the vaporized outlines of the people who had lived there had been blasted onto the walls as ghastly silhouettes. Miranda sighed. The absolute ruin in front of her was so great that she was reminded of biblical punishments rather than mere human warfare. "If only the explosion had actually helped to protect the people here," said Charles. When the bomb had detonated, the population of the area had already been at only a third of its number before the apocalypse. But if Washington had sent in its soldiers, they would still have had a chance to save the majority of the people who had been living there. By dropping the bomb instead, the entire area had been reduced to ruins. It was no wonder General Arthur O'Connor had chosen not to follow Leonard's orders. He hadn't been afraid to sacrifice himself for the greater good, but under Leonard's plan, he had known there would be no survivors to sacrifice themselves for. The bomb had done nothing to protect the people of Washington. In fact, it had achieved the opposite. Many of the civilians who had survived the blast had quickly been turned into zombies, while the zombies that had already inhabited the area had become stronger, posing an even greater threat than before. In the name of justice, Leonard had only brought greater disaster. Charles and Miranda slowed as they got closer to the center. There were fewer zombies around, so they had less of a need to rush, and they swiftly dealt with the few zombies that tried to attack them. The area's radiation level was so high that even level 4 paranormals would have been unable to withstand it. When they finally arrived at the very center, they stumbled upon a shocking scene. Some cavalrymen in black armor, immobile as statues, formed a circle, facing a giant statue of a knight in the center. Where did these statues come from? Miranda asked, shocked. Are they meant to commemorate the explosion? But who put them here? And how? She knew how ridiculous it sounded, but she couldn't think of a more likely explanation. After all, they couldn't have simply materialized out of nowhere. She turned to Charles, hoping to detect what he might be thinking. Although he had a calm expression, a fine sweat had formed on his brow. Indeed, Charles was afraid. He recognized the statues from his time in the Land of Death. "They're Nether Knights," he said, surprised to find more of them so early in the apocalypse. Miranda saw one of the statues move. "Be careful," she shouted. With robotic movements, the knights turned to face them. "We have to act quickly," said Charles. "I'll cover you while you destroy the statue in the middle." Miranda only hesitated for a moment, then she spurred on lightning and galloped at the statues. Just before she met them, she cried out and dug her stirrups into Lightning's flanks. The horse launched into the air. As soon as Miranda was in the air, Charles used as many earth amulets as he was able, cracking the ground and quickly reducing the area to rubble. The Nether Knights that hadn't fully awakened were buried in the ruins. Then he spurred Bullet to charge ahead. In midair, Lightning struck one of the knights in the head with its hooves, and Miranda used the momentum to leap toward the central statue. She didn't know why Charles wanted to destroy it, but could tell that it was vitally important she did so. The last time she had sensed him so intensely focused in battle had been when they had faced the Hive Queen. After that battle, of course, he had lost an arm and had taken 3 days to wake up. It had been by far the most difficult battle he had experienced up to that point. He had only been at level 3 at the time, while the Hive Queen had been at level 5. Miranda didn't want a repeat of that ordeal. It had felt like a miracle when Charles had eventually woken up, and she didn't want to find out if he was capable of such a recovery again. Therefore, when he had ordered her to charge, she had barely hesitated before following his order, trying to destroy the statue as efficiently as possible. A spear shaft flew through the air, piercing Lightning's flank and stabbing Miranda's arm. Lightning let out a shrill cry. Even with its great speed, it had been unable to dodge the attack, partly because its movement was slightly slowed while it was midair. Miranda ignored the wound on her arm and focused her energies on jumping to her feet, so she stood on the saddle. She drew the blood-drinking sword and used her soul energy to turn her body into a beam of light. A knight's sword brushed past her, missing her by a hair's breadth, but she had reached the statue. She swept the blood-drinking sword through the air before stabbing the statue on the forehead with her lightning sword attack. From the hole the blade had made, web-like cracks spread across the statue's head, and then across its whole body, before finally, the whole thing fell to pieces in a great explosion. She had just enough time to use her soul energy to protect her body from the worst of the blast, but was still sent flying backward by its force. She landed on the ground, rolled on her side, and spat out a mouthful of blood, her body trembling like a leaf. Still, she felt joyous. "Bet you're glad you brought me along now, Charles, huh?" she thought, grinning. Then she collapsed completely, ready to pass out. Before she knew it, though, she felt her body wrapped in a warm embrace. A current of energy wove through her body, healing her injuries. She opened her eyes to find Charles at her side, healing her. She was about to thank him when he too spat out some blood. So he's injured too, she thought. Then she spotted something even worse. A tall Nether Knight in shining black armor had arrived, towering behind Charles, a hell sword in its hand. Charles followed her line of sight and beheld the approaching knight. "This is their home turf," he said to her. "We need to get out of here, fast." He whistled for Bullet, and the horse arrived in an instant. He helped Miranda up on the saddle, and then he joined her there, taking the reins. By that point, the Nether Knights that had been buried in the ruins had begun to crawl out, shaking off the dust and mortar. Charles drew half a spear, which had been broken halfway along the shaft. Miranda recognized the spear. "But that looks like," she said. At the same time, the Nether Knight in black armor drew a weapon, the other half of Charles's spear. Miranda tried to piece together what had happened. She realized that this particular knight had remained unscathed from Charles's attacks, and that while she had been focused on the statue, the two of them had exchanged blows. Charles had charged at it with his spear, not expecting that the spear would break when it made contact. This was why Charles held one half of the spear, while the knight held the other, the same half it had used to attack Miranda's horse. Charles knew that he was facing the great Nether Knight from the Nether Abode, a terrible monster that could recover from any injury. He and Miranda had no hope of defeating the knights on their own turf, so they started to retreat. Just as they were readying to charge off, a bolt of powerful black sword energy shot down, splitting the ground in front of the Bullet and revealing a bottomless chasm. Bullet slowed for a moment, but then it leaped over the crack and galloped away. On the way back to the base, Charles contacted Lewis with his communication token. He could feel his injuries already healing. "Prepare for a large-scale war," he said. "Order the Earth-powered paranormals to build a wall, but make sure they leave an escape route. And be quick about it. Time is of the essence." Bullet had proven itself more than worthy of the title of Purple Nightmare Horse. It galloped at such a speed that the zombies didn't hinder Charles and Miranda's retreat at all. Within 5 minutes, they had returned to the base. In the meantime, the military had proven itself highly efficient. With the help of the Earth-powered paranormals, the soldiers had erected a high defensive wall encircling the base, with some snow and ice defenses for good measure. When Charles arrived, the Earth-powered and water-powered paranormals were using crystal cores to recover their energy. "What happened?" asked the Chief of Staff. He noticed that Charles and Miranda had left on separate horses, but had returned on one. Noting Charles's grim expression, he deduced that even if Miranda's horse hadn't died in battle, it had been so badly injured that it had needed to return to Hell. In fact, that was exactly what had happened to Lightning. After the attack, Charles had made sure that it had been able to escape back to Hell to recuperate. "There isn't time to go into it now," Charles said. "Listen to me. We need 500 soldiers to cover the rear. They have to be willing to sacrifice themselves to save the rest of us. Next, all our level 5 paranormals will stay behind. I'll do my best to protect them." "Understood," said the Chief of Staff. Then he gave the official order to the messenger beside him. He turned back to Charles and asked, "What else?" He knew that as Charles had scoped out the area outside the base, he would have the most accurate understanding of the situation. Charles struck the ground with his fist, opening a spell array from which more than 20 hellhounds and 50 two-horned horses emerged. "Give each level 5 warrior a horse," he said. "Order them to retreat as soon as the situation turns bad. I don't want anyone playing the hero. This war will last a long time, and we need to keep as many of our level 5 warriors alive as long as possible. The death of any one of them could lose the battle for us. Apart from the ones protecting the rear, make sure everyone retreats behind the arcane wall." The army was very efficient, and had soon selected the 500 who would cover the retreat. Charles was surprised to learn that there were 32 level 5 paranormals in the military. It showed that the crystal cores they had taken from the tens of thousands of zombies they had killed in Butte, along with those they had scavenged while in Washington, must have been of a very high quality. Of course, they could have used some of the cores to pay back some of the credit they owed to Charles. He didn't mind it too much, though. It benefited him to keep them in his debt. That way, they would still depend on him. Although he refused to ever join the army, he valued the relationship he had with them. All of a sudden, a horde of zombies rushed at them, blocking off their escape route. To Charles, they posed no threat. The only enemies that he was truly scared of were the Nether Knights. "Apart from the people who are covering the retreat," shouted Charles, "get everyone behind the arcane wall." Only then did he spot that the people covering the retreat were wearing dark iron armor. "When times get as desperate as these, we need the best armor we can get," one soldier shouted. "We owe it to the people to be as well armored as we can." The soldiers' words silenced the Daunians for a moment. They finally realized how dedicated the soldiers were to protecting as many people as they could. "These people are all highly skilled warriors," thought Charles with a heavy heart. "And yet at my order, they're willing to die to save everyone." It didn't matter how much he and his followers sacrificed. He would never get used to such moments in battle, when it became clear how much they would have to lose in order to eventually prevail. At least there was the hope that they would indeed finally prevail, though. He was so moved that he quickly took the remaining sets of dark iron armor from the energy storage space and gave them out to those soldiers in regular armor. "This is all I have," he said. "Change into it quickly." "Yes, sir," the soldiers said, and they changed into the powerful new armor. "Remember," called Charles to the retreating troops that were heading behind the arcane wall, "when you get behind there, make sure to form a strong front line. You all need to be ready for battle." Next, he turned to Mark. "The Knights will cover the retreat," he said. "They need to leave safely." "Of course," said Mark. "Whatever you say." Dale then created a ramp leading from the city walls down into the streets. Mark raised his battle axe and shouted, "Knights of Hell, charge!" The Knights charged down the ramp, cutting the zombies out of their way. Behind the Knights, the soldiers gripped their weapons in their hands, surrounding the logistics division and retreating toward the arcane wall. Tears stained their faces as they thought of their comrades who had signed up to die on their behalf. But they knew their role and didn't slow down, determined to honor those who had sacrificed themselves so readily. "Are they coming?" Charles wondered. He could sense the Nether Knights' death energy getting closer and closer, and could feel that they were picking up pace. It was clear that they were recovering their strength as they approached. This was the reason he had demanded the soldiers to cover the retreat. If the Knights arrived when the army wasn't yet ready, they would all be massacred, especially when they considered the sheer number of zombies they were up against. The sacrifice of those covering the rear was difficult to accept, but he knew that it was necessary if they were to buy everyone else time to retreat. More and more zombies surrounded the city wall, but they didn't seem in a hurry to attack. Still, Charles could feel the Nether Knights getting ever closer. Just as he was about to set his plan in motion, he had an idea. He fetched some large blue steel balls and handed them to the Chief of Staff. "Give one of these to each soldier," he said.